The most dangerous lie you've been told is that personal development is about being nice. While you've been fed endless slogans about following your passion and believing in yourself, the people who actually transform their lives use tools that are anything but gentle. They operate with precision, with strategy, with a ruthlessness that looks more like a military campaign than a self-help seminar. The truth is, transformation doesn't begin with motivation. It doesn't begin with good vibes or positive affirmations. The great architects of change, from emperors to revolutionaries, didn't wait around to feel inspired. They calculated, they planned, and then they executed with relentless discipline. You've been taught to look for feelings first. Wait until you're inspired, then act. But history shows the opposite. Feelings follow action, never the reverse. Caesar didn't cross the Rubicon because he felt like it. He crossed because years of strategy left him no other move. Alexander didn't launch into conquest because of passion. He launched because of preparation. Churchill didn't rally Britain through motivational speeches. He projected strength because strategy demanded it, even while his own mind battled despair. Every lasting transformation follows the same sequence: ruthless self-assessment, clear strategic planning, and consistent execution. The inspiration comes later, as momentum builds. It is a luxury for those who have already acted. I know this because I fell for the lie. I thought that if I just believed in myself strongly enough, the path would open. I waited for motivation like a storm that never came. And in that waiting, I lost years. My business collapsed, my finances bled, and I sat frozen, telling myself I just needed to feel ready. But readiness never came. What I needed wasn't motivation, it was a framework. That is the uncomfortable truth. Motivation is unreliable. Feelings are inconsistent. But systems, strategies, and structures, they can be designed, tested, and deployed. The people you admire don't rely on moods. They rely on playbooks. They don't hope for change. They engineer it. And yet, most people cling to three myths that keep them stuck. The first is the myth of inspiration, that you must wait until you feel ready. This turns transformation into a lottery ticket. You sit, hoping lightning strikes, instead of building the conditions that force progress. Inspiration is not the spark. It is the smoke that rises after the fire is already burning. The second is the myth of authenticity, that the key to success is finding yourself. That sounds comforting, but it keeps you passive. You don't discover identity like buried treasure. You forge it in the furnace of choices, actions, and habits. Every leader who changed history built an identity to fit their mission, not the other way around. And the third is the myth of likability, that being nice will carry you through. While you try to be liked, your competitors study leverage, timing, and positioning. They understand what Machiavelli called the effectual truth. Not how the world should work, but how it actually works. Look at Steve Jobs. When he returned to Apple, he didn't come back with apologies. He came back with ruthless focus. He cut projects, shut down distractions, and aligned everything around a single vision. That wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. And that clarity built the most valuable company in history. The point isn't to celebrate coldness for its own sake. It's to understand that strategy trumps sentiment. Results matter more than comfort. Effectiveness outweighs likability. If you want extraordinary results, you must be willing to abandon the soft illusions that keep most people stuck in mediocrity. Because here's the harsh math. 95% of people will hear this, nod, and do nothing. They'll feel a flash of determination, then settle back into the same patterns. They'll rename inaction as patience. They'll disguise comfort as wisdom. And in 6 months, they'll be facing the same problems with the same excuses. But the 5% who act differently, they will rebuild themselves with strategy. They will treat self-development as a campaign. They will think less about how they feel and more about how they position themselves, how they plan, and how they execute. And because of that, they'll break free while the majority circle in place. So the question isn't whether strategy works, it always has, across centuries. The question is whether you're willing to abandon the lies, strip away the illusions, and look at yourself with ruthless clarity. Are you willing to stop waiting for feelings and start building frameworks? Are you willing to stop trying to be liked and start trying to be effective? Because if you are, then what follows isn't motivation. It's not cheerleading. It's a manual for reconstruction, built from the same principles that forged generals, rebuilt nations, and kept leaders standing when everything else was falling apart. The first time I truly failed, I thought I was the victim of bad luck. I told myself the market was against me, clients were unreasonable, circumstances were unfair. The truth was harder. The truth was that I had fought with the wrong weapons. It was December of 2019. I was sitting in my car outside a bankruptcy attorney's office, staring at papers that spelled the end of everything I had built over 7 years. My consulting business was collapsing. My savings were gone. Loans I had personally guaranteed were now chains I would drag for a decade. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, whispering to myself, but I did everything right. And in a way, I had. I followed the rules we're all told to follow. I treated people fairly. I stayed authentic. I was transparent. I played nice. And I was broke. That night, desperate, I called my mentor, a man who had built and sold 3 companies before he turned 40. I expected encouragement, maybe sympathy. Instead, he gave me the harshest sentence I had ever heard. You failed because you fought like a gentleman in a war, being fought by savages. Those words hit like a hammer. For weeks they echoed in my head. I kept replaying them. A gentleman in a war of savages. I wanted to reject it. I wanted to tell myself the world was unfair. But deep down I knew he was right. While I was concerned with being liked, my competitors were studying leverage and positioning. While I tried to serve everyone, they were focused on eliminating threats. While I told myself honesty would build trust, they were using information as a tool, sharing it when it gave them an advantage, concealing it when it didn't. I was playing missionary, while the marketplace was run by mercenaries. The breaking point came 3 months later. I was working a temporary data entry job for $12 an hour. One afternoon, I overheard 2 co-workers whispering about a new business idea. They were describing a service nearly identical to the one I had failed to make work. The difference was how they spoke about it. They didn't talk about being the best. They talked about being the only logical choice. They didn't talk about building relationships. They talked about taking territory. I sat there stunned. They weren't smarter than me. They weren't more skilled, but they were approaching the game with a different rulebook, one I had been too polite to open. That conversation was like a slap across the face. It shattered my last illusions about the right way to succeed. That evening, I drove to the library and pulled down books I had never looked at before. Not self-help, not motivation, strategy, history, power, failure. I read not to feel better, but to dissect. I looked at my collapse, the way a general studies a lost battle. What moves did I make? Where did the enemy exploit me? What patterns led to defeat? No excuses, no blame, just brutal clarity. The picture that emerged was devastating. I hadn't failed because I lacked talent or opportunity. I failed because I had no strategy. I made decisions based on what felt right instead of what would work. I confused moral superiority with competitive advantage. I was playing checkers, while the rest of the world was playing chess. It was a revelation that burned and freed me at the same time. I finally understood why all the good intentions and authenticity hadn't saved me. They weren't weapons, they were decorations. And I had marched into war, carrying flowers. From that moment, I made a decision that terrified me. I would rebuild myself, not as a dreamer, not as a nice guy, but as a strategist. I would study power the way others study scripture. I would learn to think like Machiavelli, act like Caesar, plan like Napoleon, not because I wanted to become ruthless for its own sake, but because I needed to become effective. When I began rebuilding, I turned to the one man who had already lived through ruin and clawed his way back with nothing but his mind, Niccolò Machiavelli. In 1513, Machiavelli was stripped of his post in Florence, tortured, and sent into exile. Everything he had, power, influence, reputation, was gone in a day. He could have waited for inspiration, prayed for a new chance, or told himself to find his true self. He didn't. He studied power. He observed what rulers actually did to stay alive and hold control. Out of that brutal clarity came The Prince, not a feel-good book, but a survival manual. And in that book is a lesson people still resist. The world does not reward intentions, it rewards effectiveness. Machiavelli called it the effectual truth. Forget how things should work in theory. Ask instead, what actually works in practice? Take Caesar. For years he played the loyal servant of the Roman Republic. But when the Republic became his cage, he didn't cling to his old identity. He killed it. Crossing the Rubicon was more than a march into Italy. It was the assassination of Caesar the general and the birth of Caesar the lawgiver. He knew you cannot cling to yesterday's identity while trying to build tomorrow's empire. Or consider Alexander the Great. When he reached Tyre in 332 BCE, the city refused to surrender. Its walls were legendary, its position nearly untouchable. Alexander offered terms, generous ones that would have saved thousands. They refused. His response was ruthless but calculated. He built a causeway across the sea, besieged the city for 7 months, and when it finally fell, he executed 2,000 defenders as a warning. Cruel? Absolutely. But effective. After Tyre, cities surrendered without resistance, and in the long run, hundreds of thousands of lives were spared because the example was clear. Alexander understood that sometimes short-term severity prevents long-term slaughter. This is not about glorifying cruelty. It is about understanding that effectiveness often feels uncomfortable, and comfort often produces disaster. Winston Churchill knew this too. In private, he was plagued by depression, his infamous black dog. He was volatile, moody, filled with doubts. But when Britain stood alone against Hitler, he didn't present those feelings to the world. He presented strength, bulldog determination, unshakable resolve. His cigar, his speeches, his image became a shield that held the nation together. Leadership isn't about displaying what's authentic. It's about becoming what the moment demands. Churchill's authenticity would have doomed Britain. His strategy saved it. Theodore Roosevelt offers another example. He was born weak, asthmatic, frail. His father told him bluntly, "You have the mind, but not the body. You must make the body." Roosevelt did not sit around affirming his identity. He engineered a new one. He built a gym in his house. He read books of exploration and war. He surrounded himself with people who embodied toughness. He constructed an environment where weakness could not survive. By the time he was president, he had remade himself into one of the most formidable men of his age. And then there is Napoleon. Exiled to the island of Elba, stripped of his empire, reduced to ruling a tiny rock in the Mediterranean. For most men, that would have been the end. But Napoleon refused the identity of a defeated emperor. On Elba, he rebuilt his narrative, not as the fallen ruler, but as the master of comebacks. When he returned to France, he didn't sneak in shamefully. He marched straight to the troops sent to arrest him, opened his coat, and said, "If there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." Not a shot was fired. Within days, the same soldiers were marching with him toward Paris. That is not luck. That is the power of identity reconstruction. Notice the pattern across all these figures. They didn't wait for feelings. They didn't cling to old identities. They didn't soften their strategies to be liked. They acted with cold clarity. They positioned themselves effectively. They engineered outcomes. And here's the hard part most people miss. None of this is reserved for emperors and generals. The same principles apply to you. Your workplace is a battlefield. Your habits are armies. Your identity is a fortress or a prison, depending on how you use it. When I studied Machiavelli, Caesar, Alexander, Churchill, Roosevelt, Napoleon, when I stopped seeing them as distant figures and started seeing them as case studies, I realized that self-development isn't about feeling good, it's about becoming effective. And effectiveness demands strategy. Machiavelli himself spelled it out. A leader must be both beast and man. Too much beast and you self-destruct. Too much man and you are crushed by the world. The art is knowing when to switch, when to inspire and when to intimidate, when to be merciful and when to be ruthless. Most people pick one mode and get trapped in it. The nice become harmless. The cruel become unstable. The strategist learns to be both, and that is the point. You don't need to become cruel. You need to become calculated. You don't need to abandon values. You need to understand when values help you and when they cripple you. You don't need to imitate history's great figures, but you do need to learn their rules, because those rules have not changed. Human behavior hasn't evolved as much as we like to think. Positioning, leverage, timing, perception, these forces ruled centuries ago, and they rule today. When you internalize this, personal development stops looking like a self-help seminar and starts looking like a general's war room. It stops being about affirmations and starts being about operations. You aren't waiting for clarity. You're creating it. You aren't waiting for motivation. You're engineering it. You aren't waiting to find yourself. You're building the self that your mission requires. That's what Machiavelli saw in exile. That's what Caesar saw on the Rubicon. That's what Alexander saw at Tyre. That's what Churchill saw when Britain was burning. What Roosevelt saw when his lungs failed him. What Napoleon saw on Elba. They all face the same choice you face now. Cling to the identity that feels comfortable, or construct the identity that makes victory possible. And every time, the ones who became immortal chose construction over comfort. The question is always the same. How do you take these principles from history and put them into your own life? You're not Caesar crossing rivers or Napoleon rebuilding an empire, but you are facing battles every day. Your environment, your habits, your identity. And if you don't treat them strategically, they will treat you passively, keeping you stuck exactly where you are. I call the framework for this reconstruction the 3 pillars: environmental warfare, identity assassination, and strategic habit deployment. Let's start with the environment. Most people think of their surroundings as neutral. They're not. Your environment is either pulling you forward or pulling you down. It's making strong choices easy or weak choices automatic. There is no middle ground. Theodore Roosevelt understood this as a boy. He was sickly, asthmatic, fragile. His father told him bluntly, "You have the mind, but you do not have the body. You must make your body." That wasn't advice, it was a command. So his father built him a gym in their house. Roosevelt redesigned his environment to make weakness impossible. Over time, that environment reshaped him. By the time he reached the presidency, he was one of the toughest leaders America had ever seen. I had to learn this lesson myself. When I finally audited my own environment, I realized it was built for comfort, not for growth. My phone sat next to my bed, training me to seek dopamine before discipline. My social circle was filled with people who complained instead of built. My routines revolved around avoiding discomfort, not seeking strength. So I launched what I called environmental assault. I moved my phone to the other room so I had to get out of bed before I touched it. I placed a copy of The Art of War on my nightstand, so my first input each morning was strategy, not distraction. I replaced my comfortable reading chair with a standing desk, forcing myself into a posture of engagement.